The first thing you have to understand about a small town is that it runs on a different kind of fuel. It's not gasoline, not diesel, not even the high-octane stuff the weekend racers like to use. It runs on history, it runs on fevers, it runs on knowing whose granddad built the post office and whose mom makes the best pot roast for the church bake sale. My name is Gus, and for the last 30 years my auto shop has been the main fueling station. I don't just do oil changes and tire rotations. I'm the town's switchboard. I'm the repository of its secrets, its worries, and its quiet strengths. My hands might be stained with grease, but my mind is a clean, well-organized map of every soul in this valley. So when I tell you I knew trouble was coming before it even had a name, you have to believe me. Trouble, in this case, arrived in a pearl-white European sedan that was far too clean for our dusty roads. It had a vanity plate that just said assets. I knew right then and there this wasn't a tourist looking for our quaint little waterfall. This was a predator. If you're watching this, you probably know what it feels like to have your world threatened by someone who doesn't understand it, someone who sees your life's work as just a number on a spreadsheet. If my story resonates with you, let me know in the comments. I read every one, and if you want to hear more stories about how the little guy can fight back, make sure you subscribe to the channel. The man who stepped out of that car was named Landon Thorne. He was all sharp angles and expensive cologne, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He called himself a developer, a visionary. He said he wanted to revitalize our town, to bring in synergy and opportunity. What he meant was he wanted to gut it, paint it beige, and sell it to people who think rustic charm is something you can buy from a catalog. He bought the old Miller farm on the edge of town for a song. Then he started moving down Main Street. His method was simple, and it was brutal. He'd find a small business, usually one run by an older person, someone without the energy for a fight. His team of city lawyers would then dig up some obscure code violation, a zoning issue from 50 years ago, or an easement nobody remembered existed. Then would come the offer, a ridiculously low number, presented as a generous way out of the legal mess they themselves had created. It was legal intimidation, pure and simple, and it worked. The town council, bless their hearts, were mostly retired farmers and school teachers. They were good people, but they were out of their depth. They saw Thorne's slick presentations, his promises of increased tax revenue, and they were paralyzed by a mix of hope and fear. The first domino to fall was Henderson's Hardware. Old man Henderson, he's 82. He'd been running that shop since his father passed it on to him. He came into my shop the day after he sold. He didn't even need any work done on his truck. He just came in, sat on the old metal stool by my workbench, and stared into space. His hands, usually covered in sawdust and the smell of metal, were clean, too clean. He told me Thorne's lawyers had found a problem with the building's original 1948 deed, an issue with the property line that, if contested, would have tied him up in court until he was broke. Thorne offered him 10 cents on the dollar for the place. Henderson took it. He told me, his voice a dry rustle of leaves, "I'm just too tired to fight, Gus." I saw the shame in his eyes, the feeling of letting down his father, his town, and I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. This was just the beginning. The story repeated itself over the next few weeks. The flower shop, the diner, each one a thread pulled from the fabric of our town, leaving a hole that couldn't be easily mended. The mood in town shifted. The usual morning chatter at the coffee shop grew quiet. People walked with their heads down. Fear is a corrosive thing. It eats away at the bonds that hold a place together. Thorne was counting on that. He was counting on us to be a collection of scared individuals, not a community. He didn't know about my shop. He didn't know about the conversations that happen over the hum of a diagnostic machine. He didn't know that in a small town, the man who knows everyone's car troubles also knows everyone's heartaches. And he certainly didn't know that I was about to give this town a tune-up. Tonight is the big town hall meeting. Thorne's final presentation for his grand project, Harmony Creek Estates. He's expecting a few tearful speeches from cranky old-timers. He's expecting the council to roll over. He's not expecting a unified front. He's not expecting a room full of citizens armed with legal injunctions, media coverage, and a full forensic audit of every single application he's filed. He thinks he's fighting a few disconnected shop owners. He doesn't realize he's been fighting me, and my Rolodex is bigger than his bank account. The first month after Landon Thorne's arrival felt like a slow-motion sickness. It wasn't a sudden blow. It was a creeping dampness, a chill that got into the bones of the town and wouldn't leave. I'd see his white sedan parked outside another business on Main Street, and a day or two later, a new for sale sign would appear, stark and clinical against the familiar weathered storefronts. People were scared. You could hear it in the way they talked, a little quieter, a little more guarded. When they came into my shop, the usual talk about their kid's baseball game or the upcoming county fair was replaced by hushed questions. Did you hear about the bakery? Did you see who Thorne was having lunch with? It felt like we were being occupied by a foreign power, one that spoke a language of leveraged buyouts and hostile takeovers that we didn't understand. My shop became a sort of confessional. I'd be underneath a car, wrestling with a rusted bolt, and my customer, let's say it was Frank from the butcher shop, would just start talking. He'd tell me about the letter he got, a thick, creamy envelope with a city law firm's letterhead. It was about a shared alleyway, something about public access rights that hadn't been an issue for 70 years but suddenly was. The letter was polite, professional, and terrifying. It hinted at daily fines, at legal costs that would bankrupt him in a month. And then, a few days later, Thorne's representative would show up, all sympathy and solutions, with a purchase offer that was just enough to cover his debts and leave him with nothing. Frank wasn't a fighter, he was a butcher. He knew cuts of meat, not legal loopholes. He was thinking of taking the deal. I just listened, tightened the final bolt on his oil pan, and told him to hang on for a little while. Just see what happens. Don't sign anything yet. That became my mantra. Don't sign anything. Just wait. The real turning point for me, the moment my quiet anger hardened into cold resolve, came because of Martha Jenkins. She and her late husband, Bill, had run the Rolling Pin Bakery for 40 years. Bill was one of my best friends. We learned how to fish in the same creek. Thorne now wanted to rename Harmony Creek. We learned how to drive in the same beat-up Ford pickup. When Bill got sick, I was one of the people who sat with him in his final days. He made me promise I'd look out for Martha. After he passed, Martha kept the bakery going. It was her connection to him, to the life they'd built. The smell of her fresh bread every morning was as much a part of this town as the sunrise. She came into the shop one Tuesday afternoon, holding an envelope just like the one Frank had described. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely get the papers out. She wasn't a crier, Martha. She was tough as a $2 steak, but her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. Thorne's lawyers had sent her a notice about her ventilation system. They claimed it wasn't up to some new obscure commercial code, a code that was really meant for industrial factories, not a small-town bakery. The cost to upgrade would be astronomical, more than the bakery made in a year. The alternative, they so helpfully pointed out, was to sell. Their offer was an insult. It was less than the value of her ovens. She finally broke down. Right there, next to a stack of new tires, she just started to weep. Not loudly, but with those silent shoulder-shaking sobs that are so much worse. She said, "I can't lose it, Gus. It's all I have left of him. It's all I have." I made her a cup of my terrible coffee from the pot that's always on, and I sat with her until the tears stopped. I looked at her hands, covered in a light dusting of flour, the same hands that had baked the cake for my wedding and the cupcakes for my kids' birthdays. And I saw Landon Thorne trying to crush those hands under the weight of his ambition. He didn't see a person. He didn't see a life, a legacy. He saw a line item, an asset to be acquired and liquidated, a problem to be solved with a checkbook and a threat. That night, I didn't go straight home. I stayed late at the shop, long after the sun had set. The place was quiet, filled with the familiar smells of oil, rubber and metal. It's a smell that most people hate. but to me, it's the smell of honesty, of work, of things being fixed. I walked over to the large wooden toolbox in the corner. It was my father's. He'd started this shop, built it from nothing. He taught me everything I know, not just about engines, but about people. He used to say, "A car tells you a lot about a person, Gus. You listen to the engine, you learn about the car. You listen to the driver, you learn about the town." I opened the top drawer. Inside, nestled in worn felt, were his old tools. A set of antique socket wrenches, a heavy ball-peen hammer with a smooth, dark wood handle. I picked up a wrench, the metal cool and solid in my hand. I started cleaning it with a soft cloth, a ritual I'd performed 1,000 times when I needed to think. As I polished the cold steel, I thought about my father. I thought about Bill. I thought about Old Man Henderson and Frank and Martha. I thought about the decades of trust that had been built within these walls. Every customer who'd ever handed me their keys had placed a small piece of their life in my hands. They trusted me to fix what was broken, and right now, my town was broken. Landon Thorne was a problem I couldn't fix with a wrench, but my father taught me that you use the right tool for the job, and the most powerful tool I had wasn't in this box, it was in my head. It was the knowledge I'd accumulated over 30 years, a mental map of the town's ecosystem. I knew who was related to whom. I knew who held old grudges and who owed quiet favors. I knew who had a backbone of steel, hidden under a quiet demeanor. I knew who was a lawyer. I knew who was a journalist. I knew who sat on the county board. Thorne saw a town full of victims. He didn't see the network. He didn't see the sleeping giant. Wiping the last bit of grease from that old wrench, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let him tear this place apart. I wasn't going to let Bill down. I was going to fight, not with noise and anger, but with what I had, with knowledge, with connection. I was going to do what I always do, look at a complex, broken system, find the right parts, and quietly, carefully, put it all back together. The next morning, I made my first call. My plan wasn't some grand cinematic conspiracy hatched in a smoky back room. It was built piece by piece, conversation by conversation, right in the middle of my garage, usually with me on a creeper sliding out from under a pickup truck. It began with the understanding that Landon Thorne's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. He saw the town as a collection of isolated, disconnected assets. He couldn't conceive of it as a living organism, a web where every thread was connected. My job was to make that web visible. My job was to make it strong enough to catch him. The first person I targeted was Tom Riley. Tom's a semi-retired corporate lawyer. He'd made his money in the city, defending companies from guys exactly like Thorne, and had moved back to his hometown for some peace and quiet. He drove a pristine 20-year-old Volvo that he trusted no one but me to service. He came in for his scheduled oil change a few days after my talk with Martha. As I was checking his fluid levels, I started talking, keeping my tone casual. I mentioned how sad it was about Henderson's hardware. Then I mentioned Frank the butcher and his alleyway problem. Finally, I brought up Martha. I told him about the ventilation code. I didn't ask for help. I just laid the facts out, like I was describing a problem with his car's engine. A strange noise here, a weird vibration there. Tom stopped reading his newspaper. He took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly. "You know, Gus," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, "that particular commercial code, section 4B, I believe, has a grandfather clause for historical buildings established before 1975, and there's a specific exemption for small-scale food preparation facilities under 2,000 square feet. Thorne's lawyers would know that. They're not being ignorant, they're being predatory." He tapped his finger on the fender of his car. "Tell Martha not to worry, and tell her not to speak to them again. Have her call me. I'll make a few inquiries pro bono, just for old time's sake." When he said that, I saw the first spark. Tom wasn't just a lawyer, he was one of us. Thorne had disturbed his peaceful retirement, and he didn't like it. I just nodded, wiped the dipstick, and said, "I'll be sure to tell her." "Thanks, Tom." Number 1 connected. The next dot was Sarah Jenkins, no relation to Martha but a firecracker of a journalist. She was young, ambitious, and working for the county newspaper, a small operation she felt was beneath her talent. She was desperate for a real story, something to get her noticed by the big city papers. She drove a beat-up hatchback with a perpetually slow leak in the front right tire. She was in the shop the following week to get it patched again. While the machine was working, I started my now familiar routine. I didn't talk about legal tactics. I talked about people. I told her the human stories. I told her about Henderson, a man who'd served this town his whole life, now feeling like a ghost on Main Street. I told her about Martha, a widow trying to protect her husband's legacy. I framed it as a story of a community's heart being torn out. Then I gave her the breadcrumb. I said, you know, the strangest thing is how quickly all these properties are being bought up. It's almost like someone knew exactly which ones to target. All the deeds are being transferred to a single holding company, Main Street Revitalization LLC, I think it's called. It's all public record, of course. Over at the county records office. I'd go myself, but you know my hands are always too dirty for paperwork. I saw her eyes light up. This wasn't just a sad story about old people anymore. A holding company. That smelled like a real investigation. She paid for her tire patch and practically ran out of the shop. I knew she'd be at the records office before lunch. Dot number 2 connected. The third and most important dot was Eleanor Vance. Eleanor sat on the county board of supervisors. Her family had been in this valley since the 1800s. They'd donated the land for the town park and the library. She was quiet, dignified, and people said she had more integrity in her little finger than the entire state legislature. She was also a fierce environmentalist, particularly about the creek that ran behind Main Street, the same one Thorne wanted to turn into a water feature for his condos. She brought her old station wagon in because it was making a clicking noise, a simple CV joint replacement. As I had the car up on the lift, I talked about the development. Again, I didn't attack Thorne directly. I talked about the implications. I said, you know, Eleanor, I was looking at the preliminary plans for that Harmony Creeks project. They want to put in a massive concrete parking garage right where the old willow trees are, just 50 feet from the creek bed. I can't imagine all that runoff, all the oil and antifreeze from the new residents' cars, is going to be good for the water table, or for the trout. My dad and I used to fish for trout down there. That was all it took. Eleanor's face hardened. That creek was protected by a county ordinance she herself had championed a decade ago. An ordinance that required a full environmental impact study for any new construction within 500 feet of the bank. Not just a developer's report, but an independent one, commissioned by the county. Has Thorne submitted an independent impact study? She asked, her voice dangerously calm. I shrugged. Not that I know of. I just saw the glossy brochures he was handing out. She thanked me for fixing her car, her mind clearly a million miles away. I knew exactly where she was going. She was going to dig up that ordinance and get ready for a fight. Dot number 3, the biggest one of all, was connected. Over the next 2 weeks, I became the town's secret switchboard operator. I'd get a piece of information from one person and feed it to another, all under the guise of casual garage talk. Frank the butcher mentioned that Thorne's surveyors were asking questions about the town's sewer lines. I passed that on to the head of the Public Works Department when he came in for a state inspection. He grumbled that Thorne hadn't filed any of the necessary permits for a project of that scale. I took that information and mentioned it to Sarah, the journalist, who added it to her growing file. Tom Riley, the lawyer, discovered that Thorne's holding company was registered out of state, a classic move to obscure ownership and limit liability. He fed that to Sarah as well. Sarah, in turn, found that the holding company had a history of similar projects in other small towns, leaving a trail of broken promises and half-finished developments. She shared her findings with Eleanor, giving her the ammunition she needed for the county board. It was like building an engine from scratch. I was sourcing the parts, the lawyer, the journalist, the politician, the public official, the scared business owners, and carefully fitting them together. Each one had a specific function, a specific role to play. By themselves, they were just disparate components. But connected, they were starting to form a powerful machine. A machine that was quiet for now, but was building up a tremendous amount of torque. Landon Thorne was busy planning his victory party. He was looking at blueprints and talking to investors. He never once thought to look under the hood. He never thought that the guy with grease on his hands was quietly building the engine of his destruction. The first tremor hit Landon Thorne's world on a quiet Wednesday morning. It wasn't a bombshell, just a single, precisely worded letter delivered by courier to his temporary office in the old bank building. The letter was from Tom Riley's new, very official-looking law firm. He'd actually rented a small office space just for this, and it was an immediate cease and desist. It wasn't a lawsuit, not yet. It was something far more unnerving for a bully like Thorne. It was a statement. It informed him that a consortium of Main Street business owners had retained legal counsel to review his acquisition practices. It mentioned in dense legalese potential claims of tortious interference, predatory negotiation tactics, and fraudulent misrepresentation regarding zoning codes. It was a shot across the bow, and its primary purpose was to stop the bleeding. It put an immediate legally binding freeze on any further action against Martha's Bakery and a half-dozen other businesses that had been in Thorne's crosshairs. I heard about Thorne's reaction from Dave the courier when he came in later that day to get his van's brakes checked. Dave said Thorne read the letter, his slick smile faltering for the first time. He apparently crumpled it up, threw it at his assistant, and spent the next hour shouting into his phone at his lawyers in the city. He was panicked. This wasn't in his playbook. His strategy relied on isolating his targets, making them feel alone and powerless. The letter told him they weren't alone anymore. They had a voice, and it was a voice that spoke his language, the language of litigation. He couldn't figure out how it had happened. How did the baker, the butcher, and the florist all find the same high-powered lawyer overnight? He couldn't see the invisible lines I had drawn between them. The second tremor came 2 days later, in the Sunday edition of the County Ledger. Sarah Jenkins' article was a masterpiece of understated aggression. The headline was simple: Main Street's Changing Fortunes, a community at a crossroads. It wasn't an attack piece. It was a beautifully written feature filled with nostalgic photos of Main Street from decades past. It profiled Old Man Henderson, painting a poignant picture of a man adrift after losing his life's work. It interviewed Martha, who spoke eloquently about her husband's legacy and her desire to preserve it. It quoted other anonymous shopkeepers who expressed a vague but palpable sense of anxiety about the town's future. And then, buried in the middle of all this human interest, Sarah dropped her little bombs. She mentioned the out-of-state holding company, Main Street Revitalization LLC. She published its registration number. She noted that similar LLCs, linked to the same parent corporation, had been at the center of controversial development projects in 3 other states. She never mentioned Thorne's name in connection with those other projects. She didn't have to. She just laid the data out for anyone with an internet connection to see. Then she quoted an unnamed source at the Public Works Department, who expressed surprises at the scale of the proposed development, given that no formal applications for water or sewer hookups had been filed. It was brilliant. It didn't accuse Thorne of anything illegal. It just raised questions. It created a cloud of suspicion around his project, transforming him from a charming visionary into a shadowy, out-of-state operator. The article spread through the town like wildfire. People were talking about it everywhere: at the post office, in the church pews, over backyard fences. It changed the narrative. Thorne was no longer the inevitable future. He was a threat to be examined. The town council, which had been so cowed by his presentations, was suddenly getting an earful from their constituents. Their phone lines were ringing off the hook. Why hadn't they looked into this holding company? What did they know about these other failed projects? The fear that had paralyzed them was being replaced by a much more potent political force, angry voters. Thorne was furious. He knew he was losing control of the story. I heard he called the editor of the Ledger and threatened to sue for libel. The editor, a crusty old newsman named Carl, apparently just laughed and told him to go ahead. He could use the publicity. Thorne was used to dealing with media he could control or buy off. He didn't know how to handle a small-town paper that saw its duty as protecting its community, not appeasing a wealthy developer. His panic was starting to show. He started making mistakes. He tried to fast-track his zoning applications with the council, hoping to get them approved before public opinion turned against him completely. But he was walking right into the trap Eleanor Vance had set for him. When his applications formally landed on the council's desk, it triggered her final devastating move. This wasn't a silent takeover anymore. The engine I had built was starting to roar. Thorne could hear the noise, but he was so arrogant, so convinced of his own superiority, that he still couldn't see the mechanic who had put it all together. He just saw a series of unfortunate, disconnected problems. He still didn't see the pattern. He still didn't see me. The concept of a talent exodus in a place like my town doesn't mean a flood of people quitting their jobs. Our talent is different. It's not about resumes and skill sets you can list on LinkedIn. It's about land. It's about history. It's about the kind of deep-rooted influence that a guy like Landon Thorne could never understand, let alone buy. The power shift happened when Thorne's frantic push for approval slammed headfirst into the bedrock of our community. His big plan, the sprawling Harmony Creek Estates, had one critical dependency. It wasn't just the shops on Main Street. He needed the old McGregor pasture, a 20-acre plot of land just behind the main drag, for his planned parking structure and the back half of his condo buildings. The pasture was owned by Bob McGregor, a stoic farmer in his 70s whose family had owned that land since the town was founded. Thorne had been negotiating with Bob for weeks, and he thought he had a deal. He'd offered Bob more money than he'd ever seen in his life. He assumed, like he always did, that everyone had a price. What Thorne didn't know was that Bob McGregor and Eleanor Vance were cousins. He also didn't know that their grandfathers had co-signed a land covenant back in 1930, a document meant to preserve the agricultural character of the valley. It was an old, almost forgotten agreement, but Tom Riley, our lawyer, had assured Eleanor it was likely still legally binding. The morning after Sarah's article came out, Eleanor drove her station wagon out to Bob's farm. She didn't go to talk about money. She brought a thermos of coffee, a copy of that old covenant, and a framed photo of their grandfathers standing together on that very pasture. They sat on Bob's porch for 2 hours, just talking. The next day, Bob McGregor called Landon Thorne and told him the deal was off. The land wasn't for sale, not at any price. Thorne, I was told, went ballistic. He threatened, he cajoled, he doubled his offer. Bob's response was simple. He said, "My grandfather would be ashamed of me, Landon. This land has a purpose, and it isn't to park your fancy cars." And then he hung up. Without that land, Thorne's entire project was crippled. His architectural plans were worthless. His scale, his density, his profit margins, all of it evaporated. He was left holding deeds to a handful of disconnected storefronts on Main Street, with no room to build his cash cow behind them. This was the power shift. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, firm no from a man who valued legacy over money, and it sent Thorne into a desperate spiral. He saw his investment, his reputation, his whole house of cards beginning to wobble. That's when he finally came to see me. He pulled his pearl-white sedan right up to my main bay, blocking a customer's car. He got out, leaving the engine running, and strode into my shop like he owned it. He didn't look at the cars or the tools. He looked right at me, his eyes cold and accusatory. He'd finally started to connect the dots. He must have asked around, who knows everybody? Who's the center of this town? All roads, eventually, led back to my garage. He said, "You're the guy, the mechanic. You're the one who's been stirring up all this trouble." It wasn't a question. I just wiped my hands on a rag, slowly, deliberately. I didn't say anything. My silence seemed to infuriate him more than any argument would have. He launched into a tirade. He called me a relic, a grease monkey standing in the way of progress. He told me I was poisoning the town against its own best interest. He said, I am offering this place a future, and you're convincing them to cling to a past that's already dead. Then came the desperate counter-manipulation. He tried to buy me. He said, look, you're clearly an influential man, Gus. A man like you shouldn't be working in a dump like this. Come work for me. I'll make you my community liaison. I'll double whatever you make here, triple it. Just call off your dogs. Tell the farmer to sell. Tell the lawyer to back down. He pulled out his checkbook. Name your price. It was the only tool he had, the only solution he knew. He genuinely believed he could write a check and make all his problems go away. I finally looked him in the eye. I let the silence hang in the air, thick with the smell of motor oil. I said, some things aren't for sale, Mr. Thorne. My town is one of them. Competence isn't cheap, until you lose it. You should know. You seem to have lost a lot of it lately. I turned my back on him and went back to the engine I was working on. It was the ultimate dismissal. He stood there for a moment, sputtering, completely disarmed. He wasn't used to people he couldn't bully, intimidate, or buy. He got back in his car, slammed the door, and squealed his tires as he sped away. He thought he was making a powerful exit. All I could think was, he's going to need a brake job after all this. He was driving angry, and that's when you make the most expensive mistakes. The night of the town hall meeting, the air in the high school gymnasium was thick with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. It felt like the whole town was holding its breath. Landon Thorne and his team were set up at the front, by a large projector screen showing a slick architectural rendering of Harmony Creek Estates. He was wearing a dark tailored suit, looking confident and composed, shaking hands with the mayor and a few of the more nervous-looking council members. He surveyed the crowd, and I could see the condescending pity in his eyes. He saw a room full of farmers, shopkeepers, and retirees. He saw disorganized, emotional resistance that he could easily brush aside with a few charts and some well-rehearsed talking points. He was expecting a storm of sentiment. He was completely unprepared for the cold front of strategy that was about to hit him. The mayor, a well-meaning but perpetually flustered man named Howard, called the meeting to order. He introduced Thorne, who strode to the podium with the easy arrogance of a man who believes he has already won. He launched into his pitch, his voice smooth and persuasive. He talked about jobs, about modern amenities, about a vibrant new tax base. He showed them pictures of happy, smiling families jogging along his reimagined creek. He addressed the rumors and misinformation, dismissing them as the natural fears that accompany bold change. He was charming, he was polished, and he was digging his own grave. When he finished, he opened the floor to questions, a smug little smile on his face. He said, I'm here to listen. I want to address all your concerns. He was expecting rambling, tearful pleas. He was not expecting Tom Riley. Tom stood up from the front row, not in his usual weekend khakis, but in a sharp pinstripe suit. He looked every bit the high-priced city lawyer he used to be. He walked to the microphone set up in the aisle. Good evening, Mr. Thorne, Tom began, his voice calm and carrying through the silent gym. My name is Thomas Riley. I am the managing partner of the Riley & Associates Law Group, and I am here tonight representing a consortium of over 24 Main Street business owners, whom I believe your firm has recently contacted. Thorne's smile flickered. He hadn't expected an organized legal front. Tom continued, before we discuss the potential benefits of your project, my clients have a few questions about your methods. Specifically, we'd like to understand your firm's basis for issuing legal threats regarding alleged zoning violations that, according to our research, are demonstrably false and appear to constitute a pattern of predatory acquisition tactics. He then proceeded to cite from memory 3 specific cases, including Martha's, and the exact state and county codes that exempted them. The air went out of Thorne's sails. He started to stammer, talking about preliminary assessments and legal misunderstandings. He looked to his own lawyers, who were whispering furiously to each other, shuffling through papers. Before Thorne could recover, Sarah Jenkins stood up. She wasn't at the press table. She was just standing in the crowd holding a small notepad. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice clear and professional. "Sarah Jenkins, County Ledger, could you comment on the ownership structure of Main Street Revitalization LLC? Our investigation has traced its parent corporation to two other LLCs involved in development projects in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, both of which are currently under investigation for defaulting on municipal bonds and leaving their projects incomplete. Do you have any concerns that your financial model here might follow a similar pattern?" The crowd murmured. This wasn't just about their town anymore. This was about a pattern of behavior. Thorne went pale. He flatly denied any connection, calling it irresponsible journalism. But the seed was planted. The council members were now looking at him not as a savior, but as a massive liability. Then came the final, killing blow. Eleanor Vance, who had been sitting quietly on the stage with the rest of the board, stood up and approached the podium. She didn't address Thorne. She addressed the town. "As many of you know," she began, her voice filled with a quiet authority that commanded respect, "the county has a number of ordinances in place to protect our natural and historical resources. Any development of the scale proposed by Mr. Thorne requires a series of independent environmental, historical, and infrastructural audits to be commissioned by this board before any zoning changes can even be considered." Her gaze finally fell on Thorne. To date, Mr. Thorne has not only failed to fund these mandatory independent studies, but his own submitted plans show a flagrant disregard for established protections, particularly regarding the preservation of the Willow Creek watershed. Therefore, I am formally moving that the Town Council place an indefinite moratorium on any and all applications related to the Harmony Creek Estates project, pending a full county-led audit, a process that will likely take a minimum of 18 to 24 months. Another council member immediately seconded the motion. The mayor, seeing the overwhelming shift in the room, called for a vote. It was unanimous. It was over. In the space of 10 minutes, Landon Thorne's multi-million-dollar project had been publicly and comprehensively dismantled. He stood at the podium, speechless, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The slick veneer had cracked, revealing the panicked, impotent bully beneath. He gathered his papers, shot me a look of pure hatred across the crowded room, and stormed out of the gym, his team scurrying behind him. The room erupted, not in loud cheers but in a wave of relieved applause. People were smiling, shaking hands, hugging each other. They weren't just a collection of worried individuals anymore. They were a community again. I didn't join in the celebration. I just slipped out a side door and started the quiet walk back to my shop. My work was done. The engine was running smoothly again. In the weeks that followed the town hall meeting, a quiet sense of order returned to our town. It was like the end of a long, feverish illness. The tension in the air dissipated, replaced by the familiar, comfortable rhythms of daily life. The for sale signs on Main Street came down, one by one. Landon Thorne, true to the form Sarah's research had predicted, defaulted on his loans for the properties he had managed to acquire. The bank, now wary of any involvement, sold them back to the original owners, including Old Man Henderson, for a fraction of what Thorne had paid. It was the only good investment the man ever made in our town, and it was entirely by accident. Thorne himself simply vanished. His pearl-white sedan was gone, his temporary office cleared out. He retreated back to the city with his tail between his legs, leaving nothing behind but a cautionary tale. My life went back to normal, or what passes for normal. The smell of coffee and exhaust fumes, the constant ringing of the phone, the satisfying click of a socket wrench locking onto a bolt. But something had changed. The conversations in my shop were different. People stood a little taller. They talked about the future, not with fear, but with a sense of ownership. They had faced down the bully and won. They had rediscovered their own strength. Martha's bakery is busier than ever. She hired a young apprentice from the next town over, and she's teaching her all of Bill's old recipes. She says the bakery has a future now, not just a past. Tom Riley officially opened his small law office, specializing in community advocacy. He says it's more satisfying than any corporate lawsuit he ever won. Sarah Jenkins got a job offer from a major city newspaper, a direct result of her series on Thorn. She took it, but she still comes back on weekends. She says she needs a regular dose of small-town sanity and a patch for her perpetually leaky tire. The town is healing. The threads that Thorn had tried to pull apart were being rewoven, stronger this time. Last night, I was closing up shop, doing my usual sweep-up. The setting sun was casting long shadows through the open bay doors. Bob McGregor pulled up in his old farm truck. He didn't need any work done. He just got out, walked over, and handed me a small, heavy paper bag. I opened it. Inside were two of the biggest, most beautiful ribeye steaks I'd ever seen. He just nodded at me. That was my cousin Eleanor's idea, but the sentiment is mine. Thanks, Gus. That was it. He got back in his truck and drove off. I stood there for a long moment, holding the bag, the weight of it feeling like more than just meat. It felt like a thank you from the entire town. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the part I had played, a role I never wanted but had been proud to take on. You see, a town isn't a spreadsheet. It's not a collection of assets to be stripped and sold. It's a complex machine, built from generations of trust, loyalty, and shared experience. Sometimes, a part wears out. Sometimes, a foreign element gets in the works and threatens to grind everything to a halt. And when that happens, you don't need a slick visionary with a PowerPoint presentation. You need a good mechanic. Someone who understands how all the pieces fit together. Someone who knows that the quietest parts are often the most important. Someone who knows that you can't buy roots, you have to grow them. Landon Thorne looked at my town and saw a business opportunity. I look at it and see a collection of lives, interwoven and interdependent. He saw decay. I saw character. He saw weakness. I saw quiet strength. In the end, it's not the loudest voice that wins. It's the one that knows the system best. Competence isn't just about what you know how to do. It's about knowing who you can count on. If you've ever felt like your community or your workplace was being threatened by someone who didn't value it, I hope this story gives you a little bit of hope. Real power doesn't always come from money or a fancy title. Sometimes it comes from knowing your people, understanding the landscape, and having the patience to connect the dots. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in my situation. I'm always interested to hear your perspective. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a couple of steaks to grill.